In the cold depths of space, where the stars themselves seem to hold their breath, there exists a truth so devastating that entire civilizations have crumbled upon hearing it whispered. For 3 centuries, the Galactic Tribunal has prosecuted war criminals with ruthless efficiency, their verdicts echoing across 1,000 worlds. Never once has an accused remained silent when faced with evidence of their crimes. Never once has the galaxy's most powerful court been rendered speechless by a defendant's mere presence. Until today, Admiral Sarah Chun stands before the assembled representatives of 47 species, her hands unshackled despite the charges that could see entire star systems razed in retribution. The dossier before them contains horrors that have made seasoned prosecutors weep, atrocities so calculated and devastating that even the most hardened military minds refuse to speak them aloud. Yet as the evidence unfolds, painting her as the architect of humanity's most controversial victory, she offers no defense, no explanation, no plea for mercy. Her silence is not submission. It is a declaration of war against the very concept of justice itself. What the tribunal doesn't know is that Admiral Chin's war crimes were not committed against alien species, but against the fundamental laws of physics, morality, and survival that govern all sentient life. In the face of humanity's extinction, she didn't just break rules. She broke reality itself. Now, as the galaxy prepares to judge her, they're about to discover that some victories are so terrible, so necessary, that the victor can never be forgiven, even by themselves. The question isn't whether Admiral Chun is guilty. The question is whether the universe can survive the truth of what she saved it from. The Great Hall of the Galactic Tribunal stretched before Admiral Sarah Chun like a coliseum built for gods. Crystalline walls rose impossibly high, their surfaces alive with the soft phosphorescence of living coral from the Zephyrian homeworld. Representatives from 47 species filled the amphitheater-style seating, their varied forms creating a tapestry of evolution's wildest experiments. The air itself hummed with translation fields, converting the cacophony of different languages, chemical signals, and electromagnetic pulses into comprehensible meaning. Chin stood at the center of it all, a solitary human figure dwarfed by the architecture of galactic justice. Her gray hair was pulled back in a regulation military bun, and her dress uniform, stripped of all insignia except for her name tape, bore the subtle wrinkles of someone who had been in custody for weeks. Yet her posture remained rigid, her dark eyes scanning the assembled crowd with the calculated assessment of a career military officer. The tribunal's chief adjudicator, a towering Keth Mori whose chitinous exoskeleton gleamed like polished obsidian, raised one of its 4 arms for silence. When it spoke, its voice resonated through both audible sound and subsonic frequencies that made the smaller species in attendance shift uncomfortably. We convene this emergency session of the Galactic Tribunal to address charges of unprecedented severity, the adjudicator announced, its compound eyes fixed on Chun. The accused, Admiral Sarah Chun of the Terran Federation, stands before us charged with violations so severe that our legal archives contain no precedent for their scope. A holographic display materialized above the center of the hall, showing what appeared to be a star system. The central star pulsed with an angry red light, and the orbital paths of its planets were marked with dates and tactical symbols that made several of the military observers lean forward in their seats. The charges, continued the adjudicator, include the deliberate extinction of 17 sentient species, the destruction of 4 inhabited solar systems, the weaponization of fundamental forces previously considered inviolate, and the commission of what can only be described as temporal genocide. A ripple of shock moved through the assembly. The Veltharian representative, a being of pure, crystallized thought, pulsed with colors that indicated severe distress. Even the notoriously stoic Threnodai delegation began emitting the low, mournful tones that their species reserved for contemplating extinction-level events. Furthermore, the adjudicator continued, preliminary evidence suggests that these acts were not committed in the heat of battle or as acts of desperation, but as part of a calculated strategy spanning multiple decades. The prosecution will demonstrate that Admiral Chun orchestrated these events with full knowledge of their consequences, showing a level of premeditation that challenges our fundamental understanding of sentient morality. The holographic display shifted, showing tactical communications, fleet movements, and what appear to be research facilities hidden in the void between galaxies. Chen's image appeared in dozens of the recordings, always calm, always precise, issuing orders that resulted in the erasure of entire civilizations from the cosmic record. Prosecutor Vexthala, a member of the ancient Seraphim collective whose species had been observing galactic civilization since before humanity had learned to make fire, stepped forward. Her form was vaguely humanoid, but composed entirely of what looked like living starlight, and when she spoke, her words carried the weight of eons. "Honored representatives," she began, "we have spent the past standard year investigating what our preliminary report suggested was a case of extreme military overreach during the recent Void War. What we discovered instead was evidence of crimes so calculated, so deliberate in their scope, that they force us to question the very nature of justice itself." She gestured, and the display showed detailed analyses of destroyed worlds. Unlike the typical aftermath of orbital bombardment or even planet-cracking weapons, these worlds showed signs of something far more disturbing. The very atoms that had composed them seemed to have been convinced to forget their fundamental properties, leaving behind regions of space where matter itself appeared confused about how to exist. "These are not the scars left by conventional warfare," Vexthala continued. "What we see here is evidence of weapons that attack the philosophical underpinnings of reality itself. Weapons that don't simply destroy matter and energy, but convince the universe that certain things never existed in the first place." A hive queen from the collective swarm began generating the complex pheromone patterns that indicated deep philosophical distress. The implications were staggering. If the prosecution was correct, Admiral Chun hadn't simply committed genocide. She had committed what could only be called ontological murder, erasing entire species not just from existence, but from the possibility of ever having existed. "The evidence will show," the prosecutor continued, "that Admiral Chun didn't simply wage war against the void entities that threatened our galaxy. She waged war against the concept of existence itself, using weapons and tactics that violate not just military law, but the fundamental principles that allow conscious beings to comprehend reality." Throughout this entire presentation, Admiral Chun had remained silent. She didn't shift her weight, didn't show any emotion, didn't even blink more frequently than normal. Her silence was so complete, so absolute, that began to take on a presence of its own. Several of the more telepathically sensitive species in attendance reported feeling something like a null field around her, as if her thoughts were actively shielded by something more sophisticated than simple mental discipline. The adjudicator turned its attention directly to Chun. "Admiral Sarah Chun, you have heard the charges against you. The evidence presented suggests that you have committed acts that transcend our normal understanding of war crimes. How do you answer these accusations?" The silence that followed was deafening. Chun didn't speak, didn't move, didn't even acknowledge that the question had been asked. Her eyes remained fixed on some point in the middle distance, as if she were calculating something that existed beyond the physical boundaries of the courtroom. "Admiral Chun," the adjudicator repeated, its voice taking on harmonics that indicated growing confusion, "you are required to enter a plea. Guilty, not guilty, or if you wish to claim diminished capacity due to the psychological stresses of command, we can arrange for—" "She won't speak," interrupted a voice from the gallery. The speaker was Dr. Marcus Webb, formerly Chen's chief science advisor, and one of the few survivors of her inner circle. He was a thin man in his 60s, his face bearing the kind of lines that came not from age, but from seeing too much of the universe's darker truths. "I've been trying to get her to say something, anything, for the past 6 months. Ever since the Void War ended, she's been like this." The adjudicator's attention shifted to Webb. "Doctor, you were part of Admiral Chen's staff during the period in question?" "I was," Webb replied, standing slowly. I was there for all of it. The research, the development of the weapons systems, the decisions that led to what you're calling temporal genocide. His voice broke slightly on the last words. I could tell you everything that happened, every choice we made, every line we crossed. But Sarah, Admiral Chun, she's been silent since the moment the last void entity was eliminated from our reality. Then, you will serve as a key witness for the prosecution, Vexthala interjected smoothly. Your testimony will be crucial in establishing the sequence of events and the defendant's state of mind during the commission of these acts. Webb looked at Chun, his expression mixing grief, admiration, and something approaching terror. You don't understand, he said quietly. What she did, what we all did, it was a murder. It was surgery. Surgical removal of something so fundamentally wrong, so antithetical to the basic concept of existence, that allowing it to continue would have meant the end of consciousness itself throughout the universe. The nature of the enemy does not justify the methods employed, the adjudicator stated firmly. The Galactic Accords are clear on this matter. There are limits to acceptable conduct in warfare, regardless of the stakes. Are there? Webb asked, his voice gaining strength. Tell me, honored adjudicator, what limits would you accept on your actions if the alternative was the complete cessation of thought, feeling, and experience for every conscious being that has ever existed or ever could exist? What moral boundaries would remain relevant if the choice was between violating them and allowing reality itself to be convinced that consciousness was a mistake that needed to be corrected? The questions hung in the air like a toxin, spreading through the assembled representatives and forcing them to confront concepts that their various philosophies had never been designed to address. The Void War had been reported as a standard territorial conflict with an expansionist alien species. The public had been told that it was over, that humanity and its allies had achieved victory through superior strategy and technology. They had not been told that the enemy wasn't truly alien at all, but something far worse, a force that existed in the spaces between thoughts, feeding on consciousness itself, and growing stronger with every mind that tried to comprehend it. They had not been told that conventional warfare had proven not just ineffective but actually counterproductive, as every attempt to study or combat the void entities directly had resulted in entire research teams forgetting not just what they had learned, but that they had ever been capable of learning anything at all. The court recognizes that the Void War presented unprecedented challenges. The adjudicator acknowledged carefully. However, the response to those challenges must still be evaluated according to established legal and moral frameworks. If we allow necessity to justify any action, regardless of its scope or consequences, then we risk becoming the very thing we claim to oppose. Chen's head turned slightly at these words, the first movement she had made since entering the courtroom. For just a moment, her eyes focused on the adjudicator with an intensity that made several of the nearby representatives uncomfortable. Then, just as quickly, her gaze returned to that indeterminate middle distance. She's listening, Webb observed quietly. She hears everything. She's just processing it differently now. The things she had to think about, the concepts she had to hold in her mind to develop the weapons we use, they changed her. Not corrupted her, not driven her insane, just changed her in ways that make normal communication almost impossible. Vexthala stepped forward again, her stellar form brightening with what might have been either excitement or anger. Dr. Webb, are you suggesting that Admiral Chun is not competent to stand trial? I'm suggesting that the person standing in this courtroom isn't the same person who commanded the Terran fleet during the Void War, Webb replied. That person made choices that saved the universe, then deliberately destroyed herself to prevent those same choices from being made again. What you see now is what's left, a living memorial to the price of absolute victory. The implications of this statement sent another wave of disturbance through the assembly. If Webb was correct, then they weren't just prosecuting a war criminal. They were prosecuting someone who had voluntarily sacrificed their own humanity to preserve the humanity of everyone else. Even if we accept your characterization of events, the adjudicator said slowly, the fact remains that millions of innocent beings died as a result of Admiral Chen's actions. Entire species were erased from existence. Star systems were rendered uninhabitable not just for their current inhabitants, but for any possible future inhabitants. These consequences cannot be dismissed simply because the intentions were noble. Can't they? Webb challenged. Tell me, how many innocent beings would have died if we had done nothing? How many species would have been erased if we had limited ourselves to conventional tactics? You're prosecuting Sarah for saving a universe that included every being sitting in this courtroom, and you're doing it using the very capacity for moral reasoning that her actions preserved. The courtroom fell silent as the weight of this paradox settled over the assembled representatives. They were indeed using the consciousness that Chun had fought to preserve to judge the methods by which she had preserved it. The circular nature of the moral problem was dizzying. How could beings whose existence depended on her success fairly evaluate the means by which that success had been achieved? Chun herself remained motionless throughout this exchange, her silence now taking on an almost gravitational presence. It was as if she had become a void in the fabric of communication itself, a place where words went to be absorbed rather than heard. Several of the more perceptive observers began to realize that her silence wasn't a refusal to speak. It was an inability to translate what she had become back into the language of ordinary existence. The trial would continue, the evidence would be presented, and, eventually, a verdict would be reached. But, already, it was becoming clear that the real question wasn't whether Admiral Sarachon was guilty of war crimes. The real question was whether the concept of justice itself could survive contact with the truths that her actions had revealed about the nature of existence, consciousness, and the prices that sometimes had to be paid to preserve both. The second day of the trial began with a presentation that would haunt the nightmares of every being present for the remainder of their natural lives. Prosecutor Vexthala had spent the night preparing what she called contextual evidence, a comprehensive overview of exactly what Admiral Chun and her forces had been fighting against during the Void War. The lights in the Great Hall dimmed to near darkness, and the holographic display system engaged at maximum resolution. What appeared before the assembled representatives wasn't simply a recording or a simulation. It was a carefully reconstructed sensory experience designed to give non-human species some approximation of what human consciousness experienced when confronted with void entity manifestations. Honored representatives, Vexthala began, her stellar form providing the only significant light source in the chamber. To understand the scope of Admiral Chen's actions, you must first understand the nature of what she fought against. What you are about to experience is a heavily filtered, dramatically weakened representation of actual void entity contact. Even at this reduced intensity, I must warn you that some species may find the experience deeply disturbing. The display activated, and reality seemed to fold in on itself. What appeared before them wasn't an alien creature in any conventional sense. It was an absence that somehow had presence, a void that insisted on being acknowledged, while simultaneously denying its own existence. The visual cortex of every species present interpreted it differently, but all shared the same fundamental response, a deep, instinctual understanding that they were looking at something that should not be. Several representatives immediately activated their emergency neural dampeners. The Hive Queen's complex pheromone communications shifted to pure panic signals, and 3 of the smaller species delegates had to be escorted from the chamber when their fight-or-flight responses overrode their conscious control. This, Vexthala continued, her voice maintaining perfect calm despite the chaos around her, is a single void entity at approximately 1/10,000th of its actual psychic presence. During the war, Admiral Chen's forces encountered manifestations thousands of times more intense than this, often in groups numbering in the millions. The holographic display shifted, showing tactical analyses and scientific reports from the early stages of the conflict. The data told a story that contradicted everything the galaxy had been told about the war's progression. Far from being a conventional military conflict, the early encounters with the void entities had been disasters of unprecedented scope. Initial contact occurred in the Kepler 442 system. Vexthala explained as the display showed a thriving human colony world. Population, 47 million. The colony had been established for over a century and was considered one of humanity's greatest terraforming successes. The scene shifted to show the arrival of what appeared to be a small fleet of ships. Except the ships seemed to be constructed from crystallized emptiness, their hulls simultaneously transparent and utterly opaque. They moved through space not by propulsion, but by convincing local reality that they had always been wherever they needed to be. First contact protocols were initiated, the prosecutor continued. The colonial government transmitted standard greeting packages in 17 different mathematical and linguistic formats. The response was immediate. The holographic colony world began to change. Buildings didn't collapse. They simply forgot that they had ever been built. People didn't die. They gradually lost the ability to remember what living meant. The process was visible as a creeping wave of conceptual erasure that spread outward from the landing sites of the void ships. Within 6 hours, Kepler 442c had a population of 0, Vexthala stated flatly. Not because the inhabitants had been killed, but because the concept of inhabitation itself had been removed from local reality. The planet remained physically intact, but it could no longer support the idea of conscious beings existing on its surface. Dr. Webb, still serving as an unofficial witness despite his lack of formal legal status, stood up in the gallery. "May I address the court regarding these events?" The adjudicator gestured for him to continue. "I was part of the investigation team that studied Kepler 442 after the incident," Webb began, his voice carrying the weight of someone describing a recurring nightmare. "What Prosecutor Vexthala has shown you is accurate, but incomplete. The colony didn't just disappear, it was edited out of reality in real time. We could see the process happening, but every time we tried to study it directly, our research teams would forget what they were investigating." He paused, gathering himself before continuing. The most disturbing part wasn't the disappearance itself. It was the discovery that the void entities didn't seem to be actively hostile. They weren't conquering or destroying. They were correcting what they perceived as errors in the fundamental structure of existence. From their perspective, consciousness was a malfunction that needed to be repaired. The holographic display shifted to show the aftermath of 16 more such incidents across human space. Each followed the same pattern: arrival of void ships, gradual erasure of consciousness, and the transformation of inhabited worlds into perfect, lifeless spheres that could no longer support the basic concept of life. Traditional military responses proved not just ineffective but actively counterproductive, Vexthala continued. The void entities didn't fight human forces. They simply edited them out of the battlefield. Entire fleets would arrive to defend threatened systems, only to discover that they had always been assigned to empty space where no conflict was taking place. Admiral Chen's image appeared in the display, taken during the early stages of the war. She looked younger, her face animated with the kind of fierce determination that had made her a legend in the Terran fleet. She was addressing a joint session of the Human High Command, her words carrying across the centuries with devastating clarity. "Honored commanders," her recorded voice said, "we are not fighting an enemy that wants to destroy us. We are fighting an enemy that wants to fix us." From their perspective, consciousness itself is a cosmic mistake, and there are benevolent forces working to correct the universe's errors. This makes them infinitely more dangerous than any hostile force we've ever encountered. The recording continued, showing Chen's analysis of the early battles. Her strategic mind was clearly visible as she worked through the implications of fighting an enemy that didn't recognize the legitimacy of conscious opposition to their goals. Conventional warfare assumes that both sides acknowledge the existence of conflict, recorded Chen explained. The void entities don't acknowledge conflict because they don't acknowledge the legitimacy of consciousness to resist correction. Every time we attack them, We provide them with more evidence that consciousness produces violence and disorder, more justification for their corrective actions. The current Chun, standing silent in the courtroom, showed no reaction to seeing her younger self. But several observers noticed that her breathing pattern had shifted slightly, as if some deep part of her was responding to memories that her conscious mind could no longer access. Dr. Webb stood again. "This is when everything changed," he announced to the court. "This is when Sarah began developing what would eventually become the ontological weapons program." Vexthala's stellar form flickered with what might have been surprise. "Dr. Webb, you're introducing evidence that the prosecution had planned to present later in our case." "I'm trying to provide context," Webb replied firmly. "You're painting Sarah as a war criminal who chose the most destructive possible response to a military problem. The truth is that she was the only person in human space who understood the real scope of what we were facing." The holographic display shifted to show what appeared to be a research facility hidden in the void between star systems. The architecture was unlike anything in conventional human engineering. It seemed to be built from crystallized mathematics, with structures that folded through dimensions that normal space couldn't accommodate. The ontological weapons program, Webb continued, wasn't designed to fight the void entities directly. It was designed to fight the conceptual framework that allowed them to exist. Sarah realized that if consciousness was incompatible with their version of reality, then we needed to create weapons that could enforce our version of reality in their presence. Several representatives began showing signs of distress as the implications became clear. The Threnodai delegation began emitting harmonics that indicated philosophical vertigo, and the crystalline Voltharian observers' normally stable light patterns began fluctuating wildly. "Dr. Webb," the adjudicator interrupted, "are you saying that Admiral Chun developed weapons that could attack abstract concepts?" "I'm saying she developed weapons that could convince the universe to prefer one interpretation of reality over another," Webb replied. "Weapons that didn't destroy void entities so much as persuade existence itself that they had never been possible in the first place." The courtroom erupted in chaos as the full implications hit the assembled delegates. The Hive Queen began generating distress pheromones so intense that several other species activated emergency filtration systems. The philosophical implications were staggering. If humans had developed the ability to edit the fundamental nature of reality itself, then every other species in the galaxy existed only a humanity's sufferance. "Order!" the adjudicator commanded, its subsonic voice cutting through the chaos. "Dr. Webb, these are serious accusations. Are you claiming that Admiral Chun possessed weapons capable of altering the basic laws of physics?" Webb looked at Chen's motionless form before answering. "I'm claiming that she possessed weapons capable of altering which laws of physics were considered valid by local reality. The void entities existed in a framework where consciousness was impossible. Sarah's weapons created a framework where void entities were impossible. The two frameworks couldn't coexist, so reality had to choose. And the 17 extinct species mentioned in the charges," Vexthala demanded. Webb's expression grew pained. Collateral damage. Species that had already been partially edited by void entity contact. When Sarah's weapons activated, local reality couldn't distinguish between entities that had been corrupted by void contact and entities that had been created by it. From a universe's perspective, they were all part of the same ontological error that needed to be corrected. The silence that followed was deafening. Every representative present was grappling with the realization that they were judging someone who had literally rewritten the rules of existence to save consciousness itself. The moral framework they were using to evaluate her actions was itself dependent on those actions having succeeded. Chen remained motionless throughout this revelation, her silence now taking on new meaning. She wasn't refusing to defend herself. She was preserving the universe's ability to judge her by maintaining a careful distance from the thought patterns that had made the ontological weapons possible. Her silence was a gift to the galaxy, protecting them from the terrible knowledge of exactly how reality could be rewritten. The prosecution acknowledges, Vexthala said slowly, that the circumstances of the Void War were unprecedented. However, the methods employed by Admiral Chen still resulted in the extinction of 17 sentient species. Regardless of the context, this court must determine whether such actions can ever be justified. Can they be? Webb asked quietly. Sarah saved every conscious being in the galaxy by sacrificing her own capacity for normal thought. She preserved everyone's right to judge her by giving up her own ability to explain why judgment itself was only possible because of what she did. If that's not justice, then what is? The question hung in the air like a mathematical proof that nobody wanted to solve. The trial would continue, more evidence would be presented, and eventually a verdict would have to be reached. But already it was becoming clear that they were not simply judging Admiral Sarah Chun. They were judging the very nature of moral reasoning itself, and discovering that some questions were too large for the frameworks designed to contain them. Outside the courthouse, across 47 worlds, billions of conscious beings went about their daily lives, blissfully unaware that their capacity for thought, feeling, and moral judgment existed only because one human woman had chosen to sacrifice her own humanity to preserve theirs. The irony was as perfect as it was terrible. The universe was using the consciousness she had saved to condemn the methods by which she had saved it. And, in the center of it all, Admiral Sarah Chun stood in perfect silence, bearing witness to a trial that could never truly judge her because the judges themselves existed only as evidence of her success. The third day of testimony brought forth evidence that would have been classified as impossible under the old understanding of physics. Technical specialist Zura Okafor, a quantum engineer who had served under Admiral Chun during the development of ionological weapons, stood before a holographic display showing schematics that hurt to look at directly. The fundamental challenge, Okafor explained, her dark hands gesturing at diagrams that seemed to fold through dimensions the observer's brain couldn't quite process, was creating technology that could operate on the level of conceptual reality rather than physical reality. The void entities existed as living contradictions. They were present without occupying space, active without performing actions, conscious without possessing minds, as we understand them. The assembled representatives struggled to follow the technical presentation. Even the Seraphim Collective, whose species had mastered technologies that other civilizations considered godlike, found themselves intellectually strained by concepts that operated outside conventional spacetime. Dr. Okafor interrupted the Kethmori adjudicator. Please explain in terms that the court can comprehend. What exactly did Admiral Chen's weapons do? Okafor paused, clearly struggling to translate concepts that existed beyond normal language. Imagine that reality is a vast library containing every possible way that existence can be organized. The void entities were trying to remove all the books that described conscious beings as valid parts of reality. Admiral Chen's weapons went into that same library and removed all the books that described the void entities as valid parts of reality. But the 17 extinct species, Prosecutor Vexthala interjected, her stellar form pulsing with controlled intensity. How do they fit into this metaphor? Okafor's expression grew pained. Some books in the library had been edited by the void entities. Pages describing those species had been partially rewritten to make consciousness incompatible with their existence. When our weapons activated, the universe couldn't tell which parts of those books were original and which parts were void corruption. So it threw out the entire books. The implications sent another wave of disturbance through the courtroom. The Veltharian representatives' crystalline form began cycling through colors that indicated deep philosophical distress, while the Threnodai delegation's harmonic communication became so agitated that translation systems began failing. Dr. Webb stood from his position in the gallery. May I provide additional context? Honored adjudicator? Dr. Webb, while the court appreciates your insights, you are not formally part of these proceedings, the adjudicator replied carefully. Then, make me part of them, Webb said firmly. Charge me as a co-conspirator, subpoena me as a witness. I don't care. But Don't pretend you can understand what Admiral Chen did without understanding what we all did. I was there for every decision, every calculation, every moment when we had to choose between preserving our humanity and preserving humanity itself. The courtroom fell silent as the weight of this distinction settled over the assembled beings. Preserve our humanity versus preserve humanity itself. The difference between maintaining moral purity and ensuring that morality could continue to exist as a concept. Vexthala consulted with her legal staff before responding. The prosecution will accept Dr. Webb as a hostile witness, with the understanding that his testimony may be used to establish the scope of the conspiracy charges. I accept those terms, Webb replied immediately. The adjudicator gestured for him to approach the witness stand, a raised platform that adjusted itself to accommodate the varied physiologies of the galaxy species. As Webb walked forward, Admiral Chen's head turned slightly, the first voluntary movement she had made since the trial began. Dr. Webb, Vexthala began, you have stated that you were present during the development of the ontological weapons. In your professional opinion, did Admiral Chen understand the potential consequences of deploying these devices? She understood consequences that the rest of us couldn't even conceive, Webb replied immediately. Sarah didn't just understand that 17 species would be erased from existence. She understood that failing to erase them would result in the eventual erasure of all conscious life in the universe. That is speculation, Vexthala objected. The court cannot weigh hypothetical casualties against documented ones. Is it hypothetical? Webb challenged. Dr. Okafor, please display the cascade probability analysis that Admiral Chen ordered during the final stages of the war. Okafor hesitated, looking between Webb and the prosecution table. That analysis is still classified at the highest levels of Terran intelligence. Declassify it, Webb said simply. If this court is going to judge Sarah for war crimes, they need to see exactly what would have happened if she had chosen differently. The holographic display flickered and changed, showing what appeared to be a predictive model of staggering complexity. Mathematical formulae cascaded through virtual space like living things, each calculation branching into hundreds of possibilities that themselves spawned thousands of subcalculations. This is a four-dimensional probability matrix modeling the spread of void entity influence across the galaxy over a projected time frame of 500 years, Okafor explained reluctantly. The analysis assumes that Admiral Chen's forces chose not to deploy ontological weapons and instead continued with conventional resistance. The model began to animate, showing the gradual but inexorable spread of conceptual erasure across inhabited worlds. Unlike the dramatic explosions of conventional warfare, this was a quiet apocalypse. World after world, simply forgetting how to support consciousness until the galaxy became a perfect, lifeless void. Timeline completion, 237 years, Okafor announced quietly. Final casualty count, approximately 400 billion conscious beings across 1,256 species. End result, a universe where consciousness never evolved and never could evolve. Several representatives had to be provided with emergency medical attention as the full scope of the alternative timeline became clear. The Hive Queen's complex pheromone communications shut down entirely, replaced by a single, monotone chemical signal that roughly translated to system overload. Dr. Webb, the adjudicator said carefully, are you asking this court to believe that Admiral Chen committed war crimes in order to prevent a larger genocide? I'm asking this court to understand that Admiral Chen didn't commit war crimes, Webb replied. She committed acts that are beyond the scope of traditional morality because the situation she faced was beyond the scope of traditional existence. You can't judge someone for breaking rules that were written for a universe where consciousness was guaranteed to continue existing. Prosecutor Vexthala's stellar form flickered with what appeared to be frustration. Dr. Webb, regardless of the consequences of an action, the fact remains that Admiral Chen made deliberate choices that resulted in the extinction of sentient species. The Galactic Accords are clear that such actions constitute war crimes regardless of motivation. The Galactic Accords, Webb said quietly, were written by conscious beings for conscious beings living in a universe where consciousness was a fundamental constant. Admiral Chun discovered that consciousness wasn't a constant. It was a variable that was being systematically edited out of reality. The Accords don't apply to situations they were never designed to address. This statement caused what could only be described as a philosophical riot among the assembled representatives. The very foundation of galactic law was based on the assumption that certain things, consciousness, the capacity for moral reasoning, the existence of individual agency, were universal constants that could serve as the basis for legal frameworks. If those constants were actually variables, then the entire structure of interstellar civilization was built on a foundation of philosophical quicksand. Order, the adjudicator commanded, its subsonic harmonics reaching frequencies that forced several species into temporary paralysis. Dr. Webb, are you claiming that the Galactic Accords have no validity in this case? I'm claiming that the Galactic Accords only have validity in this case because of what Admiral Chin did, Webb replied. Every word of every law, every concept of justice, every notion of individual rights, they all exist only because Sarah chose to preserve consciousness at the cost of her own moral innocence. He turned to look directly at Chin's motionless form. She knew what the cost would be. Not just the immediate cost in lives lost, but the permanent cost to her own capacity for normal moral reasoning. The weapon she used required her to think thoughts that no conscious being should ever have to think, to hold concepts in her mind that were fundamentally incompatible with sanity as we understand it. And now, the adjudicator asked, now she exists as a living monument to the price of absolute victory, Webb said softly. She can't speak because the part of her mind that understood language was sacrificed to make the ontological weapons possible. She can't defend herself because the part of her that understood normal moral reasoning was destroyed by the concept she had to master to save us all. The courtroom fell into a silence so complete that several species activated emergency life support systems, mistaking the absence of sound for the absence of atmosphere. In the center of that silence, Admiral Chun stood like a statue carved from human determination and inhuman sacrifice. Dr. Webb, Vexthala said eventually, even accepting your characterization of events, the court must still address the question of accountability. If Admiral Chun cannot be held responsible for her actions due to her current mental state, and if those actions cannot be judged according to existing legal frameworks, then how can this tribunal function? Webb considered the question for a long moment before answering. Maybe it can't, he said finally. Maybe some actions are so far beyond the scope of normal existence that they can't be judged by beings who exist within that scope. Maybe Admiral Chin's greatest crime was forcing the universe to confront the possibility that sometimes the only way to preserve morality is to transcend it. The implications of this statement spread through the courtroom like a cognitive virus, infecting every attempt at rational response. If Webb was correct, then they were not simply prosecuting a war criminal. They were trying to apply finite legal concepts to infinite moral questions and discovering that the attempt itself might be fundamentally meaningless. The prosecution, Vexthala announced after a lengthy consultation with her legal staff, maintains that regardless of the philosophical implications, this court has a duty to render judgment on the actions of Admiral Chun. The law must mean something, or civilization itself becomes meaningless. Does it? Webb asked quietly. Or does civilization become meaningful precisely because people like Sarah are willing to sacrifice their own place within it to ensure that it continues to exist? Outside the courthouse, across the galaxy, billions of conscious beings continued their daily lives, their thoughts and dreams and moral judgments, all possible only because one human woman had chosen to think thoughts that destroyed her own capacity for normal existence. The trial would continue, evidence would be presented, and eventually a verdict would be reached. But the questions raised by Admiral Chin's actions would continue to echo through the universe long after the last gavel had fallen. forcing every conscious being to confront the terrible possibility that sometimes the greatest act of love was the willingness to be forever misunderstood for it. The fourth day of the trial brought an unexpected development that would fundamentally alter the nature of the proceedings. As the court prepared to hear testimony from survivors of the extinct species, a disturbance in the quantum substrate beneath the courthouse forced an emergency evacuation of the lower levels. Admiral Chen's first voluntary action since the trial began was to turn her head and look directly at the source of the disturbance. Her eyes, which had remained unfocused and distant throughout the previous days, suddenly sharpened with an alertness that made several nearby guards step back instinctively. "Something's wrong," Dr. Webb announced, rising from his seat in the gallery. Sarah only reacts like that when there's a threat to the quantum stability of local space-time. The adjudicator's compound eyes fixed on Webb. "Dr. Webb, what are you implying?" Before Webb could answer, the courthouse's emergency alert system activated, flooding the Great Hall with harmonized warning tones calibrated for 47 different species. The holographic displays flickered and began showing sensor readings from the building's substructure. "Quantum coherence failure in sublevel 7, announced the courthouse's AI system. Causal loop formation detected in sublevel 12. Temporal paradox cascade beginning in sublevel 15. All personnel evacuate to minimum safe distance of 50,000 kilometers." The assembled representatives began moving toward the exits with varying degrees of panic. But Admiral Chun remained motionless. Her silence, which had been passive throughout the trial, suddenly became active, a focused concentration that seemed to push against the growing disturbance beneath them. "She's stabilizing it," Dr. Webb breathed, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and terror. "Whatever's happening down there, Sarah's holding it back through pure force of will." Technical specialist Okafor, who had remained in the courthouse to provide additional testimony, began frantically checking her portable sensors. "This is impossible," she muttered, then spoke louder. "The quantum signature matches the residual effects of ontological weapon deployment. Something down there is trying to convince local reality that this courthouse never existed." Prosecutor Vexthala's stellar form blazed brighter as her species' equivalent of adrenaline flooded her system. "Are you saying we're under attack by void entities?" "No," Webb replied grimly. "We're under attack by the consequences of destroying them. Some effects of the ontological weapons were designed to manifest years after deployment. Sarah called them ethical ecosystems, delayed responses that would force future generations to confront the true cost of what we did." The adjudicator, despite its species' legendary composure, began showing signs of distress. "Dr. Webb, are you saying that Admiral Chun designed weapons with built-in delayed effects?" "I'm saying she designed weapons that would eventually reveal their true moral implications to anyone trying to judge their use," Webb explained. "The quantum disturbance isn't random. It's triggered by the act of putting her on trial. Reality itself is being forced to choose between maintaining the existence of a legal system that can judge her actions and maintaining the existence of the person whose actions made that legal system possible." The courthouse shuddered as the disturbance below grew stronger. Through the quantum sensors, they could see space-time itself beginning to unravel in carefully controlled patterns. It wasn't chaotic destruction. It was surgical removal of causal connections, the same technique that had been used to eliminate the void entities. "The building is being edited out of existence," Okafor reported, her voice tight with controlled fear. "But the editing is following legal protocols. It's removing the courthouse while preserving the people inside it, as if reality is trying to dismiss the trial on jurisdictional grounds." Admiral Chun suddenly spoke for the first time since entering the courtroom. Her voice was quiet, precise, and carried harmonics that made translation systems struggle to process it. "The weapons," she said simply, "were designed to preserve justice by making it impossible to use them unjustly." The effect of her words was immediate and devastating. Every conscious being in the courtroom felt the weight of absolute certainty settling over them like a physical force. She wasn't speaking as Admiral Chan the defendant. She was speaking as Admiral Chan, the architect of reality, the person who had rewritten the fundamental laws of existence to include safeguard against their own misuse. Sarah Dr. Webb whispered, "You're destabilizing local space-time just by talking." "The trial must end," Chen replied, her voice carrying overtones that existed in dimensions the listeners couldn't perceive. "Not because I'm innocent or guilty, but because the question of my innocence or guilt cannot coexist with the continued existence of consciousness in this region of space-time." Prosecutor Vexthala stepped forward, her stellar form flickering with what might have been desperation. "Admiral Chun, the court demands an explanation. If you designed your weapons to prevent legal accountability, then you have committed an even greater crime against the concept of justice itself." Chen turned to look at the prosecutor directly, and, for a moment, every being in the courtroom experienced a flash of what it felt like to hold the weight of universal consciousness in a single mind. The sensation lasted only an instant, but it was enough to send half the remaining representatives into temporary catatonic states. "I designed the weapons," Chun said slowly, "to preserve the right of conscious beings to judge the actions taken to preserve their existence, while preventing them from destroying themselves through the exercise of that right. The moral paradox you are experiencing is not a flaw. It is the intended result." The courthouse continued to phase in and out of existence around them, but the process had stabilized into a steady rhythm, like the breathing of some vast entity. Through the quantum sensors, they could see that the building was being maintained in a state of controlled non-existence, present enough to house the trial, but absent enough to prevent the trial from resolving in a way that would damage the fabric of reality. "You created a legal singularity," the adjudicator said, its voice mixing accusation with something approaching admiration. "A situation where justice can be contemplated, but never achieved." "I created a memorial," Chun corrected. "A permanent reminder that some victories are so terrible that they can only be commemorated, never celebrated or condemned. The trial will continue forever, and it will never reach a verdict, because the act of reaching a verdict would retroactively invalidate the actions that made the trial possible." Dr. Webb stared at his former commander with a mixture of horror and understanding. "You turned yourself into a living paradox. A war criminal who can never be convicted, because convicting you would eliminate the legal system doing the convicting. And an innocent person who can never be acquitted, because acquitting me would legitimize actions that transcend the moral framework within which innocence has meaning," Chen added. "The trial itself is the punishment and the memorial and the warning for future generations." The implications spread through the remaining consciousness in the courtroom like a slow-acting poison. They weren't just prosecuting Admiral Chun. They were participants in an eternal moral exercise designed to force the universe to continuously confront the question of what prices were acceptable to pay for survival. "The 17 extinct species," Vexthalis said desperately. "Surely their deaths deserve justice." Chen's expression softened slightly. "They receive the only justice possible, eternal remembrance by beings whose existence was purchased with their sacrifice. Every time consciousness anywhere in the universe contemplates moral questions, they participate in honoring that sacrifice. The trial is their memorial as much as it is my punishment." Technical specialist Okafor, who had been monitoring the quantum readings throughout this exchange, suddenly looked up from her instruments with an expression of dawning comprehension. "The entire courthouse isn't just being maintained in controlled non-existence," she announced. "It's being broadcast. Every conscious being in the galaxy is receiving subliminal quantum transmissions of these proceedings." "The trial isn't just happening here," Webb realized. "It's happening in the subconscious mind of every sentient being in the galaxy." Sarah turned the entire universe into a courtroom, and every conscious thought is simultaneously prosecuting, defending, and judging her actions. Admiral Chin nodded slightly. "Consciousness itself has become the jury, and consciousness itself will spend eternity deliberating on a question that has no answer. This is not punishment or reward. This is responsibility. The responsibility that comes with being saved by actions you can neither condemn nor condone. The courthouse shuddered again, but this time it was settling into its final configuration, a structure that existed simultaneously in all possible states of judgment, where every conscious being could experience the full moral weight of survival purchased at an impossible price. The prosecution, Vexthala said quietly, her stellar form dimming with something approaching defeat, withdraws all charges. Not because Admiral Chun is innocent, but because the concept of legal proceedings has been rendered meaningless by the scope of her actions. The court, replied the adjudicator, cannot accept that withdrawal. The trial must continue, not because justice can be served, but because the attempt to serve justice is now a fundamental property of conscious existence itself. And so the trial would continue, not for days or weeks or years, but for as long as consciousness existed in the universe. Every moral decision made by every sentient being would be, in some small way, a continuation of the proceedings against Admiral Sarachun. The woman who had saved the universe had transformed herself into a permanent resident of its conscience, ensuring that the cost of that salvation would never be forgotten and never be fully understood. In the great hall of the Galactic Tribunal, Admiral Chun stood in perfect silence, no longer a defendant, but a living testament to the terrible mathematics of survival. She had become the question that consciousness would spend eternity trying to answer, the price that intelligence would forever know it had paid, and the reminder that some victories could only be achieved by those willing to be eternally misunderstood for achieving them. 100 years after the trial began, the courthouse had become something unprecedented in galactic history, a living monument to moral complexity that existed in a state of controlled temporal paradox. Beings from across the galaxy made pilgrimages to experience the eternal proceedings, not seeking answers, but seeking to understand the questions that consciousness itself was built upon. Dr. Marcus Webb, now sustained by technology that had extended his natural lifespan far beyond human norms, continued to serve as the primary witness to events that had transcended normal concepts of legal proceedings. His hair had long since turned white, his face marked by the peculiar lines that came from spending a century contemplating impossible moral equations. Admiral Sarachun remained exactly as she had been on that first day, standing in perfect silence, her form unchanged by the passage of time, because time itself moved differently around her. She had become a fixed point in the universe's moral geography, a constant against which all other ethical considerations could be measured. The current session was being observed by representatives of species that hadn't even existed when the trial began. Evolution itself had accelerated in response to the moral pressures radiating from the courthouse, with new forms of consciousness emerging specifically to grapple with the philosophical implications of Chen's actions. Honored observers, announced the current adjudicator, the seventh to hold the position since the trial's beginning, we convene today's session to address evidence that has emerged from the galactic consciousness during the past decade. The holographic displays activated, showing what appeared to be a map of local reality with regions marked in different colors. Most of space appeared in familiar blue, but there were growing patches of gold that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. These, explained the current prosecutor, a crystalline entity from a species that had evolved specifically to process multidimensional legal concepts, are regions where the influence of Admiral Chen's actions has begun to manifest new forms of consciousness. Beings that exist as living embodiments of moral questions rather than biological entities with moral capabilities. Dr. Webb stood, his movement aided by exoskeletal supports that had become necessary as his enhanced body struggled with the temporal distortions surrounding the courthouse. May I address the court regarding these manifestations? Dr. Webb, you have served as a witness to these proceedings for a full century, the adjudicator replied. Your perspective is always welcome. Webb approached the holographic display, studying the golden regions with eyes that had been modified to perceive the quantum structures underlying moral reasoning. These aren't anomalies, he announced. They're exactly what Admiral Chun predicted would happen. The ontological weapons weren't just designed to eliminate the void entities. They were designed to transform the universe into a place where consciousness could actively participate in its own moral evolution. The assembled observers, now numbering in the millions as beings from across the galaxy participated through quantum entanglement networks, experienced a collective moment of understanding. The war hadn't ended with the defeat of the void entities. It had transformed into something far more profound, the universe itself becoming conscious of its own moral choices. Dr. Webb, the prosecutor continued, are you saying that Admiral Chen's actions initiated a form of directed evolution in consciousness itself? I'm saying that Sarah didn't just save consciousness, Webb replied. She elevated it. The beings emerging in those golden regions aren't just conscious, they're consciousness that has become aware of its own moral structure and can actively modify that structure based on ethical considerations. One of the golden regions pulsed brighter, and suddenly, the courtroom was filled with the presence of something that couldn't be seen, but could be felt by every conscious being present. It spoke without words, communicated without language, and conveyed concepts that existed beyond the normal boundaries of thought. The presence identified itself as what humanity might call an ethics, a being that existed as the living embodiment of moral reasoning itself. It had come to testify on behalf of the 17 extinct species whose deaths had sparked the original charges against Admiral Chun. We speak for those whose voices were silenced. The ethics communicated, its message appearing directly in the consciousness of every observer. We are their continuation, their moral legacy transformed into living principle. The question of justice for their deaths cannot be answered because their deaths were not endings, but transformations. The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled consciousness. The extinct species hadn't simply died. They had been transformed into fundamental properties of universal moral reasoning. Every ethical decision made anywhere in the galaxy was, in some way, their consciousness continuing to exist in a new form. Admiral Chun, the ethics continued, its attention turning toward the silent figure at the center of the proceedings, the being you were has been dissolved into the framework of universal consciousness. The being you exists to maintain the bridge between what was sacrificed and what was preserved. We do not seek justice for our transformation. We seek understanding of why it was necessary. For the first time in a century, Admiral Chun moved. She turned toward the presence of the ethics, her eyes focusing with an intensity that made the air itself seem to vibrate with potential energy. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that existed in dimensions of thought that most beings couldn't perceive. Because, she said simply, consciousness without the capacity for moral evolution is consciousness without hope. The void entities would have preserved consciousness, but eliminated its ability to grow, to change, to become something greater than what it was. I chose to preserve the growth at the cost of the preservation. The ethics pulsed with something that might have been approval. And now consciousness evolves not despite moral complexity, but because of it. Every ethical choice strengthens the fabric of reality. Every moral question improves the universe's ability to support more complex forms of consciousness. Dr. Webb suddenly understood the full scope of what his former commander had achieved. You didn't just defeat an enemy, he said wonderingly. You transformed the universe into a place where the enemy could never exist again. Not by destroying the concepts they represented, but by making those concepts impossible through moral evolution. Chen's gaze returned to the middle distance, but this time her silence carried a different quality. It wasn't the silence of someone who couldn't speak, but the silence of someone whose work was finally complete. The trial, the ethics announced, must end not with judgment but with understanding. Admiral Chun cannot be convicted because her actions transcended the legal frameworks designed to contain them. She cannot be acquitted because her actions required the destruction of her own capacity for normal moral reasoning. She exists in the space between guilt and innocence, maintaining the paradox that allows moral growth to continue. The adjudicator, after consulting with legal experts from across the galaxy for several hours, returned with the tribunal's final decision. This court finds that Admiral Sarah Chun exists in a state that cannot be defined by traditional concepts of guilt or innocence. Her actions were simultaneously the greatest crime and greatest gift in the history of conscious existence. Therefore, this tribunal declares the proceedings permanently suspended in a state of eternal consideration. The courthouse, the adjudicator continued, will remain as a monument to the complexity of moral reasoning. Admiral Chun will remain as the embodiment of questions that consciousness must continue to ask itself. And the trial will continue as a fundamental property of moral thought throughout the universe. As the formal proceedings ended, something unprecedented happened. Beings from across the galaxy began to approach Admiral Chun, not to judge or thank her, but simply to stand in the presence of someone who had sacrificed their own humanity to preserve humanity itself. She acknowledged none of them directly, but her presence seemed to confer a kind of peace on those who approached. They left understanding something that couldn't be put into words, that some victories were so profound that they could only be achieved by those willing to be misunderstood for eternity, and that the greatest gift consciousness could receive was the preservation of its ability to struggle with impossible moral questions. Dr. Webb remained in the courthouse long after the formal sessions had ended, studying his former commander with the complex emotions of someone who had spent a century trying to understand a friend who had transcended the very concept of friendship. "Was it worth it, Sarah?" he asked quietly, knowing she might not answer. Admiral Chun turned toward him one final time, her eyes briefly focusing on the man who had shared her impossible burden. When she spoke, her words were intended for him alone, carried on quantum frequencies that only their shared experience could interpret. "Ask me again when consciousness has evolved beyond the need for questions like that," she said softly. "When every moral choice strengthens rather than weakens the fabric of reality. When the universe itself has become capable of the kind of growth that was once possible only through sacrifice." She paused, and, for just a moment, he could see in her eyes the woman she had been before the weight of infinite responsibility had transformed her into something beyond normal human understanding. "Ask me when consciousness itself has learned to love not despite moral complexity, but because of it," she concluded. "Then I'll know whether the price was worth paying." As the courthouse settled into its eternal vigil, beings across the galaxy returned to their daily lives, carrying with them a new understanding of what it meant to be conscious in a universe where consciousness itself was capable of evolution. They carried questions that had no easy answers, moral complexities that strengthened rather than weakened their capacity for ethical reasoning, and the knowledge that their very ability to struggle with these questions was the gift that Admiral Sarah Chun had died to preserve and lived to maintain. In the center of it all, the woman who had saved the universe continued her eternal watch, standing in the space between hero and villain, protector and destroyer, human and something greater than human. She was the question that consciousness would spend eternity trying to answer, the price it would forever know it had paid, and the reminder that sometimes the greatest act of love was the willingness to be misunderstood for it. The trial was over. The judgment would continue forever, and consciousness itself would evolve, grow, and become something greater than it had ever been, precisely because one human woman had been willing to sacrifice her own capacity for growth to make that evolution possible. In the silent spaces between thoughts, in the quantum foundations of moral reasoning, in the deepest structures of what it meant to be conscious, Admiral Sarah Chun's legacy continued, not as memory, but as the fundamental architecture of a universe where consciousness and morality had become indivisible, where every ethical choice was an act of creation, and where the capacity for moral growth was the most precious gift that existence could offer itself. The story ended where it began, with silence. But it was a different silence now, pregnant with possibilities that had been purchased at an impossible price, heavy with questions that would drive consciousness forward into forms of existence that hadn't been possible before one woman chose to sacrifice everything to make them inevitable. Humanity, yeah. Not because humans were perfect, but because when faced with the ultimate test, one human had been willing to become something beyond human to ensure that humanity and consciousness itself could continue to become something better than what it had been.